Hey there, horror fans. How are you doing tonight? We hope you're ready for another spine-chilling journey into the unknown. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from our viewers all around the world. Tonight, we have a story that will leave you questioning what lurks in the dark corners of the world. A family moves into a house in the woods, only to realize that they're not alone. The shadows are far darker than they could ever have imagined. Get ready for the unseen guests, a tale of fear, suspense, and terror that you won't soon forget. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Here at Tales of Horror, we bring you the creepiest, most thrilling tales that will keep you up at night. Ready to face the darkness? Let's begin. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a house that isn't truly alive, yet seems to breathe with every passing moment? A place where the silence is thick, almost palpable, and where shadows twist and shift in ways that don't make sense. You try to look away, but they're still there, just out of sight, hiding in the corners of your vision. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of the lights, they seem to have a life of their own. And then, as night falls, the house takes on a different persona, one that whispers and sighs, as if it's aware of your every move. But what if this place wasn't as empty as it appeared? What if there were things here, things you couldn't see, but that you could most certainly feel? What if your new home harbored guests that were invisible, yet always present, waiting in the dark? They feed on fear, becoming stronger the more you dread their presence. And soon, the question becomes not just about the house, but about you. How long will it take before you're no longer alone, in the most terrifying way imaginable? Welcome to The Unseen Guests. The sun had long set when the Thompson family pulled their moving truck up to the secluded house. The narrow, winding road that led to their new home disappeared into a dense, shadowy forest. They had driven for hours, leaving the noise and chaos of city life behind, seeking refuge in the peaceful isolation of the woods. It seemed like the perfect escape, the ideal place to start fresh, away from prying eyes, the relentless hum of traffic, and the endless demands of modern life. As the headlights of the truck illuminated the towering trees, the family caught their first glimpse of the house. It stood there, tucked deep into the woods, hidden from the world. A large, two-story farmhouse with ivy creeping up its brick walls, the kind of house that looked like it had a history, old, weathered, and filled with untold stories. The porch light flickered as if trying to welcome them, but there was something unsettling about it. Something faintly off. Sarah Thompson, a mother of two, felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at her skin. She took a deep breath, trying to inhale the crisp scent of the forest, the earthy smell of pine and damp leaves, but something lingered beneath the surface. A faint, musty odor that she couldn't quite place. She shook it off, blaming it on the long drive. "This place is perfect," Michael, her husband, said with a grin as he surveyed their new home. His eyes sparkled with excitement, his energy unwavering as he eagerly started unloading boxes from the back of the truck. He was ready to begin this new chapter of their lives, and he was determined to make it work. But Sarah didn't share his enthusiasm. She forced a smile, trying to match his optimism. In truth, she wasn't sure how she felt about the move. The weight of the uncertainty pressed on her chest. The house, while beautiful, felt isolated, even a little suffocating. There were no neighbors for miles, no bustling streets or busy shops, just an expanse of trees and silence. The kind of silence that felt too thick, too heavy. Her two children, Mark and Emma, were already darting off toward the tree line, their excitement bubbling over as they ran through the woods, eager to explore. Sarah watched them for a moment, their laughter echoing in the night air, but her eyes were drawn back to the house. The front door stood ajar, as if it were inviting them in, but Sarah felt a strange reluctance. There was something about the way it loomed against the backdrop of the dark forest, like it had been waiting for them. "Michael," Sarah began, her voice trailing off as she stared at the house, the feeling of unease growing. But Michael, too caught up in the thrill of their new beginning, didn't seem to hear her. He was already heading toward the front door, carrying a heavy box under one arm. "It's going to be great, Sarah. Just wait. Once we get settled in, you'll see." He gave her a reassuring smile. A fresh start. A new home. No more traffic, no more distractions. Sarah nodded, trying to push the feeling aside. She had made the decision to move, after all. She was the one who had suggested this remote location in the first place, believing it would give them a chance to reconnect as a family. But now that they were here, in the shadow of the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was almost as if the house were watching them, waiting. A gust of wind rustled the leaves above, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold wasn't the only thing that made her shiver. It was the silence, that unnerving stillness that hung in the air. It felt as if the woods had swallowed up every sound, every trace of life, leaving nothing but a deep, unsettling quiet. But she shook off her thoughts. She needed to be strong for the kids. They were already running around the yard, full of energy and excitement. The trees loomed around them like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The house, in the dim light of the porch, seemed to grow darker, its windows black and uninviting. Sarah felt a flicker of doubt again, but she quickly dismissed it. They were here to start fresh, to build a new life. The house was just a house. Or was it? As Sarah stepped closer to the porch, she felt something brush against her shoulder, a faint, fleeting sensation, like the whisper of a hand, cold and barely there. She spun around, but the yard was empty. Mark and Emma were still playing near the trees, oblivious to her sudden discomfort. She took a deep breath and stepped inside the house, hoping that the warmth and familiarity of her family would push away the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The interior of the house was just as old as the exterior, but there was a certain charm to it. The floors creaked beneath their feet, and the smell of dust and age filled the air. The furniture was sparse, mostly left behind by the previous owners, but it was enough to get them started. They'd bring in their own things soon enough. For now, it was enough to have a place to rest. Michael set down the box in the living room and looked around, nodding approvingly. "Not bad, huh? We can fix it up, make it our own." Sarah forced another smile, but her eyes kept drifting back to the stairs. The staircase, with its worn wooden steps, loomed like an invitation to explore deeper into the house. The second floor remained hidden in the shadows, but Sarah couldn't help but feel as though something was up there, watching. "Mom! Look what we found!" Emma's voice broke through her thoughts, and Sarah turned to see her daughter holding up a small, old-fashioned key, its edges tarnished with age. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Where did you find that?" "Upstairs," Emma said, her eyes wide with excitement. It was just sitting there on the floor in one of the rooms. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen any keys when they toured the house. She hadn't seen any spare keys left behind by the previous owners, either. Could this key belong to some hidden door, some forgotten room? Or had it been left there for a reason? "Let me see that, sweetie," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady as she reached for the key. The cold metal felt heavier than it should, almost as if it carried the weight of something hidden within the house. She turned it over in her hand, but there were no markings, no clues to where it might belong. "Well, we'll figure that out later." But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the key meant more than just a simple forgotten relic. Why had it been left behind? Why had Emma found it now, on their very first night? As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest outside seemed to fade into an almost oppressive silence. The only sounds in the house were the creaks and groans of the old structure settling. Sarah tried to ignore the feeling of being watched as she prepared dinner, but every so often, she would glance toward the stairs, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing at the top. Something told her that the house was not as empty as it seemed. And as she looked at the darkened rooms above, she couldn't help but wonder, what else was waiting in the shadows? Michael seemed oblivious to her growing sense of unease, his laughter filling the room as he and the kids joked about the things they'd need to fix around the house. But Sarah couldn't let go of that strange feeling that something was waiting for them. Something that had been here long before they arrived. The first night in the house was uneventful. At least, that's how it seemed at first. After a long day of unpacking and settling in, the Thompson family gathered around the fireplace in the cozy, albeit slightly chilly, living room. The warmth from the fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The crackling of the logs filled the space, soothing the nerves that had been frayed by the stress of the move. They ate dinner together, enjoying the comfort of normalcy as they shared stories of their past and dreams for their new life. Michael was in good spirits, his excitement contagious as he talked about how he could already see the potential in their new home. He talked about the garden they'd plant in the spring, the renovations they could make to the kitchen, the possibilities that lay ahead. The children, Mark and Emma, were equally animated, running around the room pretending to be explorers in a wild jungle. The family was happy, for the moment. But deep down, Sarah couldn't shake a feeling, something just beyond the edge of her awareness. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. And though she smiled and laughed along with the others, a small, gnawing anxiety lingered in the back of her mind. As the hours passed, the wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees. The house creaked and groaned under the strain of the storm. Old houses did that, Sarah told herself. It was just the wind, just the way the old timbers settled as they adjusted to the change in temperature. But there was something different about the sounds. They weren't like the normal creaks of a house. This was a groaning, a bending as if the house itself was stretching, trying to expand. Sarah furrowed her brow. The wind had been fierce, but this felt deliberate. She glanced at Michael, but he was lost in conversation with Mark, their voices carrying easily over the crackling fire. It was then that she heard it, a faint whisper. So soft at first, she thought she might have imagined it. A voice, no louder than a sigh, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was indistinct at first, just a murmur, like a distant conversation from the next room. Sarah turned her head quickly, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. Nothing except the wind, the fire, and the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Just the house settling, Sarah thought, but her heart wasn't convinced. She stood up from the couch, excusing herself to check on the kids. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fire behind her. She walked quietly, her footsteps muffled against the thick carpet, but the whisper seemed to follow her. No, it wasn't following her, it was in the walls, in the very air. She shook her head, her thoughts racing. She was just tired. Overthinking things. The move had been exhausting, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the whisper came again, louder this time, clear enough that Sarah could almost make out the words. It's too late. Her blood ran cold. Mark was the first to notice something truly unusual. He had excused himself from dinner, heading down the hallway toward the bathroom. The shadows in the hall grew longer, stretching as the dim light from the living room barely reached the distant corners of the house. As he walked, he felt a chill in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones, despite the warmth of the fire just a few rooms away. It wasn't until he reached the bathroom door that he noticed it, a flicker in the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just the light playing tricks on him, or maybe the wind outside moving something in the house. But when he looked again, his heart skipped a beat. There, at the far end of the hallway, he saw a figure, someone, something, dart across the doorway. His breath caught in his throat. He spun around, eyes wide, searching the hall for any sign of movement. But the hallway was empty. The air was still. There was nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching longer with each passing second. Mark blinked, his mind racing. Was he imagining things? Could it have been his own reflection, or a shadow cast by the wind? He laughed softly to himself, shaking his head as if to dispel the fear. It was nothing, just his imagination. He turned back toward the bathroom, the unease lingering like an uncomfortable weight on his chest. When he returned to his bedroom, the image of the shadowy figure was still fresh in his mind. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing himself to sleep, but his thoughts kept drifting back to what he'd seen. Had it been real? Or had his mind created the image in the darkness? But it wasn't just the shadow that bothered him. It was the feeling. That thing that had moved in the hallway, it felt wrong. Like something wasn't supposed to be there. Something that didn't belong. As the night deepened, the house grew quieter. The fire in the living room burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Sarah and Michael had finally retired to their bedroom, the kids tucked safely into their rooms down the hall. But sleep didn't come easily to Sarah. She awoke with a start, her heart racing, the covers tangled around her legs. The room was freezing cold, despite the warmth of the fire still crackling faintly in the other room. She sat up quickly, her breath coming out in sharp, visible puffs, the cold air biting into her skin. The room was dark, save for the faint glow from the fireplace that filtered through the cracks in the door. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, but the unease that had followed her all day was now a persistent feeling, gnawing at her insides. And then she heard it. A whisper. Soft. So soft that it might have been a dream, but no, it was real. It was in the air, like a breeze brushing past her ear, so close she could feel the warmth of it. Come closer. Sarah's body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, listening, but there was nothing. Just the wind outside, howling through the trees. The house groaned again, its old bones stretching under the pressure. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing, that she was just tired. The move had been hard on everyone, the stress of starting fresh. Her mind was playing tricks on her. But the voice, it had felt so real. Suddenly, there was another sound, faint at first, but growing clearer by the second. It was a low, soft murmur, almost like a distant conversation, but there were no words. Just that low, unsettling hum, echoing from somewhere far away. It's time, the voice said. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She threw the covers back, her feet hitting the cold floor as she stood. She glanced around the dark room, her eyes flicking to the door, the walls, the ceiling. Was someone else here? Was Michael awake? But no. The room was empty. She was alone. She quickly grabbed her robe and stepped into the hallway, the sound of her footsteps muffled against the plush carpet. As she moved toward the children's rooms, the whispering seemed to intensify, filling the air with a disembodied presence. She stopped at Mark's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The soft murmur echoed from behind it, a deep, guttural sound that made her stomach turn. But she couldn't tell where it was coming from, inside the room, or from somewhere far deeper in the house. She pressed her ear to the door, and that's when she heard it again, clearer now, coming from just behind the walls themselves. Come closer. You've been chosen. Her blood ran cold. The whispers were growing more insistent. And then, silence. She waited, breath held in her chest, wondering if she had imagined it all. But the air felt thicker now, heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. The whispers had stopped, but they left an eerie emptiness in their wake. As Sarah turned back to her bedroom, the house felt different, darker, more oppressive. Something had changed, something she couldn't quite explain. And in the stillness of the night, one thought echoed in her mind. What had she just heard? And who, or what, was speaking? The next few nights in the house brought with them a growing unease. At first, it was little things, small occurrences that might have been dismissed as mere forgetfulness or the quirks of an old house. But as the days wore on, these occurrences became harder to ignore. Things began to move on their own. Objects that Sarah was certain she had placed in one spot would be found in another, as though they had a life of their own, shifting around when no one was looking. One evening, Sarah left a book on the kitchen counter, intending to finish it after dinner. When she returned a few hours later, the book was gone. It wasn't on the counter, nor on the table where she sometimes set it down. She searched the room, even under the sink, and in the drawers. It wasn't there. After a few minutes, she gave up, thinking maybe she had just forgotten where she placed it. But the next morning, when she walked into the living room, there it was, lying flat on the coffee table as if it had been waiting for her all along. She stared at it for a long moment, a knot forming in her stomach. Michael, too, began to notice strange occurrences. He would leave his tools in the garage, only to return and find them missing. Not misplaced, but gone, as though someone, or something, had taken them. At first, he chalked it up to his own absent-mindedness. Perhaps he had forgotten where he'd left them. But then it started happening too often. One evening, he placed his wrench on the workbench, and when he returned 10 minutes later, it was nowhere to be found. He searched the entire garage, nothing. The wrench didn't reappear until the following morning, tucked neatly on the windowsill. Michael felt a chill, but he brushed it off. He didn't want to alarm Sarah, who was already on edge. But as the days went by, the occurrences grew more frequent, more deliberate. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate something to them, trying to get their attention. Mark was the first to speak up about hearing things. At first, it was just an occasional creak from the hallway, or the faint sound of footsteps late at night when everyone was asleep. He thought nothing of it, just the house settling, no doubt. But then it started to happen more frequently. Every night, just after midnight, he would hear them. Soft, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside his room. At first, he thought it was his father, waking in the middle of the night. But when he ventured out one evening, he found the hallway empty, no one was there. He stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, listening to the silence. For a moment, he thought maybe he was just imagining things. But when he went back to his room, the footsteps started again, closer now, as if someone, or something, was moving just outside his door. Mark didn't say anything to his parents. He didn't want to seem crazy, and besides, he wasn't sure if he could trust what his ears were telling him. It was just his imagination, wasn't it? He had to be hearing things. But then it happened again. One night, Sarah was in the living room, curled up with a book. The soft crackling of the fire filled the air, a soothing background to her quiet evening. Michael had gone to bed early, and the children were asleep. The house was peaceful, quiet. Or so she thought. She was lost in the pages when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. At first, it was so soft that she almost missed it, but then it grew louder, unmistakable. A slow, steady breath, heavy and deliberate. It was coming from outside her bedroom door. Her heart skipped a beat. The room, despite the warmth of the fire, suddenly felt unnervingly cold. Sarah set her book down slowly, her eyes fixed on the door as she strained to listen. The breathing continued, deep, labored breaths, like someone was standing just outside her door, waiting. Michael was already asleep beside her, his steady breathing filling the room, but Sarah couldn't tear her gaze from the door. It was as though the house itself had grown alive, the silence thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of that breathing. It was rhythmic, methodical. And then it stopped, abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there had vanished into thin air. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She reached out to gently shake Michael awake, but as she turned, she realized something: she couldn't hear his breathing anymore. The room was eerily still, and the weight of the silence pressed in on her. She froze, her eyes darting to the clock beside the bed. It was 2:13 a.m. A chill crawled up her spine as she lay there in the dark, listening for any sound, any sign that she wasn't alone. She wanted to call out to Michael, but she was paralyzed, her mind racing, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move in the darkness, a shadow passing quickly across the far wall. Her heart hammered in her chest as she blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. No. This couldn't be happening. Not again. As the days passed, the occurrences escalated. No one in the Thompson family was immune to the strange happenings. Every room in the house seemed to hold its own secrets, its own forces that were impossible to explain. The kitchen was the worst. Sarah would leave dirty dishes on the counter, only to return hours later to find them washed and stacked neatly. At first, she thought maybe Michael had done it, but he denied it, and neither of them had seen the children go near the kitchen. One night, Sarah was up late, cleaning the kitchen after dinner, when she heard a soft whisper again. This time, it was coming from the living room, from the direction of the fireplace. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper was faint but unmistakable, like a voice from another world, barely audible but so close she could feel it on her skin. Come closer. The voice was too much like the one she had heard before, the one that had haunted her in the darkness outside her bedroom door. She swallowed hard and turned, slowly walking toward the living room. The fire crackled as the shadows danced along the walls, and she could swear she saw something move in the corner of her eye. But when she stepped into the room, there was nothing. No one. Just the shadows, stretching long and dark across the room, as if the house itself was waiting. That night, after the family had gone to bed, Sarah lay in the dark, her mind racing. She was certain now, there was something in the house with them. Something that was invisible, but undeniably present. She could feel its weight, its oppressive force pressing in on her from all sides. It was watching them, waiting for them to acknowledge it. She turned her head toward the door, as if expecting to see someone standing there. But no one was there. Yet the feeling remained, someone was watching her. She wasn't alone. She reached for Michael, who was already fast asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. She lay still, listening to the darkness, trying to ignore the rising panic in her chest. But then, the house gave a low, deep groan, one that seemed to come from the very foundation, as though the house itself was waking up, stretching and shifting as it prepared for something. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway once more, and this time, they were not faint or distant. They were close, too close. A chill ran through Sarah, and she bolted upright in bed, her breath quick and shallow. She couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but she knew they were still there. Something was out there. Something was in the house, moving in the dark, feeding on their fear. And then the voice returned, clear as day, but this time, it wasn't a whisper, it was loud, clear, and unmistakable. "We're waiting for you." The Thompsons had spent days trying to explain away the strange occurrences. Each day brought something new, a faint knock on the walls, a cold spot in the middle of the room, the furniture moved just slightly enough that it could be dismissed as an accident. But as the days wore on, Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched, that the house wasn't just creaking with age, it was alive, and it was observing them. Sarah began to research the house's history, thinking maybe there was some rational explanation. Perhaps it had been abandoned for too long, maybe there were animals in the walls, or even structural issues causing the noises. But every lead seemed to turn cold. No previous owner had lived there for more than a few months, and the house's history was a patchwork of tenants who either moved away or disappeared without explanation. There was no information about why the house had been abandoned for so long. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah and Michael found themselves sitting in the living room once again, this time searching through the stack of old papers they had found hidden in the attic. They had been there for hours, flipping through faded documents, old photographs, and tax receipts, each one offering no more insight into the house's dark past than the last. But then Michael found it. Behind a loose floorboard in the corner of the attic, wedged in so tightly it was almost invisible, was a small, leather-bound journal. It looked ancient, the edges of the pages yellowed and fragile. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for it, the weight of it sending an electric chill through her hand. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling the cold, cracked leather beneath her fingertips. The journal's edges were worn and frayed, but the initials on the cover were still legible, J.C., the same initials they had seen in the old property documents they'd dug through earlier. Jonathan Cray, Sarah whispered, the name sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Michael didn't need to ask. He could see the look on Sarah's face. They both knew that this was no ordinary journal. The house had been hiding something, and this was their first real clue. But what would they find inside? Sarah opened it slowly, the pages crackling as they moved, the ancient smell of dust and mildew filling the air. The journal began innocuously enough. Jonathan Cray wrote about the typical daily life of a house owner, repairs to the roof, fixing a leaky faucet, the usual troubles with the plumbing. But as Sarah read further, the tone of the entries began to shift. They grew darker, more frantic. It was as if Jonathan's mind was unraveling the longer he stayed in the house. March 14th. I don't know what to make of it. The house feels different. The air is thick, heavy. Last night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. I thought it was just my imagination, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night, the silence in the house was too oppressive. I feel like I'm being watched, like someone is just waiting, hidden in the dark corners of the house. March 18th. The whispers have started. They come at night, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then louder. I thought I was losing my mind. But then I found it, a figure standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make it out, just a shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, but it was there, watching. I tried to call out, but no sound came. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, waiting for it to vanish. But when I woke up, it was gone. March 25th. They are getting closer. I feel them now, watching me constantly. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes. It's like the house itself is alive. I hear them at night, calling to me, whispering things I don't understand. I try to ignore them, but I can feel the darkness spreading, curling around me like a living thing. I tried to leave today, but the door wouldn't open. I've tried every window, every exit. I'm trapped here with them. March 28th. I can hear them now, during the day, when the sun is high. They whisper from behind the walls, behind the floorboards. I've sealed every crack in the house, but it does no good. I can't escape them. They're getting stronger. I fear I am beyond saving. The final entry sent a chill through Sarah's bones. Michael was reading over her shoulder, his face going pale as the words settled in. March 30th. These creatures, they feed on fear. The more you fear them, the stronger they become. I fear I am beyond saving. They are everywhere. I feel them in the air, in the walls, in my bones. They are not human. They were here long before me, and they will remain long after I am gone. No one will ever be safe here. It's too late for me, but perhaps someone will find this journal. Perhaps someone will know what I've discovered. But it is too late. The house has claimed me. I am not alone." The words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on Sarah and Michael. They had known something was wrong with the house, but this, the journal's revelation, was something entirely different. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just filled with the restless spirits of those who had come before them. The entities Jonathan described were something else entirely. They weren't ghosts. They weren't echoes of the past. These were creatures, something darker, something ancient. Sarah's voice trembled as she read aloud the last few words of the journal. "The house has claimed me." She let the journal fall into her lap, her hands shaking. "What does that mean? What happened to him?" Michael didn't answer right away. His face was ashen, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the terror Jonathan had documented. The idea that these creatures fed on fear, became stronger the more afraid their victims were, was terrifying. It was no wonder Jonathan had felt trapped, driven to madness by whatever was haunting him. "There has to be more," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "This can't be all there is. He must have figured something out. He must have known how to stop them." But Sarah wasn't so sure. What if there was no way to stop them? What if they were trapped in this house just as Jonathan had been, slowly being consumed by something they couldn't see, something that fed off their fear? Her breath caught in her throat as she thought of the shadowy figures that had appeared in the corners of their vision, the whispers in the walls. Had they been feeding on her fear all along? Michael stood up abruptly, his face grim. "We need to leave. We need to leave now, before..." Before he could finish his sentence, the house seemed to groan, a deep, low sound that shook the walls. It was the same noise they had heard before, the creaking of old bones shifting, but this time, it felt different. It felt like the house itself was waking up, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Then, a sharp crack rang out. Sarah turned to the corner of the room where the old wooden floor had split open. Her eyes widened as she saw something dark, move beneath the floorboards. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something alive. The air in the room thickened, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Michael grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "We need to get out, Sarah. Right now." But before they could make a move, the whispering started again, louder this time, surrounding them from all directions. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the air. The voice was clearer now, more insistent. "Come closer, we are waiting." The tension in the room was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing heavy with dread. They had always thought it was just a haunted house. But now, with Jonathan Cray's journal in hand, they understood the terrifying truth: there was something far more sinister at work here. These creatures weren't just spirits, they were predators, and they had been waiting for someone to enter the house, someone to feed on. And now, the Thompsons had unknowingly become the prey. The real horror had only just begun. The Thompsons had tried everything they could think of. They researched, they tried to reason with the unexplainable, they even considered calling in an expert on the supernatural, but nothing worked. The house had a way of swallowing their thoughts, of erasing their peace with each passing moment. The longer they stayed, the more the strange occurrences piled up. And each event, each unexplained movement, seemed to become more deliberate, more focused on them. As the days passed, Sarah felt as if the house was slowly taking over her mind. Every corner of their new home was filled with a heavy presence, an invisible weight that crushed her chest and made it hard to breathe. The more she tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, the more the house proved her wrong. She could feel it in the air, something was there, just beyond her reach, always watching, always waiting. It wasn't just the typical hauntings, either. The Thompsons quickly learned that the strange happenings weren't caused by ghosts, at least not in the traditional sense. They weren't the restless spirits of the dead, longing to communicate or make their presence known. These entities were different. They had no physical form, nothing to see, nothing to touch. They were invisible, but their presence was unmistakable. They interacted with the world around them, not by appearing as ghosts, but by manipulating it. And they didn't just want to scare the Thompsons, they wanted something deeper, something darker. The first thing Sarah noticed was the temperature. It wasn't the natural chill of an old house settling in the cold night air, it was something unnatural. The temperature dropped suddenly, in an instant, and the chill would linger, not dissipating even when the house seemed to warm up. The rooms would shift from comfortably warm to unbearably cold in a matter of minutes. The only place that was ever consistently warm was the living room, where the fire burned brightly. But when Sarah ventured into the hallway or upstairs, the cold would bite at her skin, seeping through her clothes, clinging to her bones. It wasn't just the cold that unnerved her, it was the air itself. It grew thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. In certain rooms, it felt like the air was charged with something dark, something malevolent. The air felt alive, as though it was waiting, stretching and contracting with every breath the family took. Each time Sarah passed through the hallways or moved between rooms, she felt as if she was being followed, as if something was just behind her, a presence so close it could almost reach out and touch her. The house had begun to feel like a living organism, breathing, shifting, and growing with each passing day. At night, the whispers started. Soft at first, they sounded like the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls, faint and distant. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They seemed to come from every direction, swirling around Sarah, filling her mind with their strange words. She couldn't make out all of them, but the ones she could hear were chilling. Come closer. We are watching. You cannot hide. It wasn't just Sarah who heard them. The children, too, began to speak of the whispers, though they didn't seem as frightened by them. They thought it was the house settling, the wind, or maybe the sound of the trees outside rubbing against the windows. But Sarah knew better. The voices weren't from the wind, they were coming from inside the house. They were coming from the walls. The next escalation came with objects. It started small, books moved from one shelf to another, a glass that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was found on the floor in the living room. But soon, the objects began to move with more purpose, more force. Books flew off shelves as though someone had swiped them off with an invisible hand. Tables rocked, chairs scraped across the floor of their own accord. But it wasn't just the small things. One night, a heavy lamp fell off a side table, crashing to the ground without any cause. There were no drafts, no breeze to explain the sudden shift. At first, Michael tried to rationalize it. It's an old house, he'd say. Maybe there's something wrong with the foundation, or the wiring. But as the incidents became more violent, even he started to falter. One evening, he watched, wide-eyed, as a chair moved across the room by itself. It didn't slide, it seemed to float, inching across the floor as though it was being dragged by an invisible force. Sarah was beginning to break down. She spent hours searching the house for any logical cause, drafts, loose floorboards, wires that might be sparking. But no matter how much she searched, she couldn't find an explanation. There were no loose pipes, no drafts, no logical cause for the noises and movements. It wasn't just the house settling, it was something else, something far more sinister. The most terrifying experience came one night when Sarah woke up to the unmistakable sound of breathing, heavy, labored breathing. Her heart raced as she lay still in the darkness, straining her ears. The sound wasn't from outside the house. It was close, so close she could feel it in her chest, the deep, slow exhale filling the room like an invisible fog. Michael was fast asleep beside her, his breathing steady and slow. But this this was different. The breathing outside their door was erratic, as if something was struggling to breathe, or perhaps waiting to exhale. Every night after that, Sarah would lie awake, unable to sleep, listening to the strange sounds that echoed through the walls. The breathing continued, louder and more deliberate each night, growing closer and closer, until it felt as though something was just outside her door, standing silently, waiting. The stress was beginning to take its toll on the Thompsons. They no longer felt safe in their own home. They had stopped sleeping in their own rooms. Sarah and Michael slept in the living room, the only room that felt marginally safe, with the fire burning steadily in the hearth. But even the living room wasn't immune. There were nights when Sarah would wake to find the fireplace completely out, the room colder than any other. Other times, the fire would flare unexpectedly, the flames roaring high, as though being stoked by an invisible hand. It wasn't just the physical changes, it was the psychological toll that was really starting to show. The whispering never stopped. It seemed to come from everywhere, pressing on Sarah's mind like a physical force. She could hear it even when the house was quiet, and the shadows would stretch longer, darker, no matter the time of day. As days passed, Sarah's nightmares became more vivid. She would wake up in cold sweats, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling. She could still hear the voices, still feel the cold breath on her neck. It wasn't just the physical world she feared anymore. The house had begun to take over her mind, her thoughts, her very perception of reality. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were speaking directly to her, "You are ours." She wasn't sure if they were in her head, or if the house was truly alive, but it was becoming harder to distinguish between what was real and what was the work of her own mind. One evening, Sarah sat alone in the living room, staring at the fire. Her mind was foggy, her body exhausted, but the moment she felt the temperature drop again, so suddenly that her breath caught in her throat, she knew something was wrong. This was different. The house was not simply cold, it was actively drawing warmth away from her, feeding off her energy, her fear. And then, the door slammed shut, with a force so violent that it rattled the entire room. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. She stood up quickly, her legs shaking as she stepped toward the door. And that's when she saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room, blacker than the dark, darker than anything she had ever seen. It was shifting, stretching, undulating as though it had a life of its own. The whispering was louder now, a deafening chorus of voices, all of them speaking in unison. "We are waiting. Come closer. Feed us." The shadow began to move toward her, its form twisting in the air as it grew larger, more defined, like something was rising from the depths of the darkness. She backed away slowly, but no matter how much space she put between herself and the shadow, it followed, moving with an unnatural speed. And then, the breathing started again, this time, right behind her. The invisible guests were here, and they were hungry. The Thompsons had reached their breaking point. They could no longer go a night without being haunted by the oppressive presence that filled every inch of their home. The invisible guests, as they had come to think of them, were no longer just an unsettling force in the background. They had become a constant, lurking threat in the corners of their vision, creeping into every room, every conversation. The house was no longer just a place to sleep, it was a battlefield, and they were losing. Sarah felt herself unraveling. Every night, the whispers became louder, more insistent, as though the walls themselves were speaking to her. Her dreams were filled with dark figures moving through the shadows, with cold, invisible hands reaching out to pull her under. The pressure of it all, the relentless terror, the feeling that something was always watching, was wearing her down, making her feel like she was losing herself. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt peace. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt safe. Michael, too, had become a shell of his former self. He was jumpy, unable to focus. He couldn't sleep for fear of what might happen when his eyes closed. The creatures in the house seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger the more they cowered. Michael tried to act tough, for the sake of the kids, but Sarah saw the fear in his eyes. It was as though he could see the same thing she saw, the darkness closing in, inch by inch, until there would be no escape. Mark and Emma had become more withdrawn, their laughter now replaced by an eerie silence. They spoke less and less about what they saw and heard, but it was clear they were both frightened. They spent most of their time huddled together, avoiding the areas of the house where the air felt thick, where the whispers were strongest. The breaking point came one night when Sarah saw something in the hallway that she couldn't explain. She had been walking down the dark corridor, a quiet hum of whispers filling the space, when she saw it, a figure. It was faint at first, just a shadow flickering in the corner of her eye, but when she turned to face it, the shadow solidified, taking the form of a tall, thin shape. It wasn't human, but it felt like it had been there all along, standing just out of sight. Its form shifted, like smoke, like it wasn't fully real. But its eyes, those eyes, burned into her, cold and hollow. She didn't scream. She couldn't. She stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Sarah ran to Michael, waking him from a restless sleep, her body trembling with the memory of what she had just seen. She could see the fear in his eyes as he listened to her, but he didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to stop this. The house was no longer just a home, it was a trap. And they were the prey. In desperation, Sarah reached out to an expert she had found through an old book about hauntings. The expert's name was Margaret, a woman known for her work with dark entities, beings far older and more malevolent than the average ghost. Margaret had helped others in situations like theirs, and Sarah held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could help them too. Margaret arrived on a stormy afternoon, her car pulling up the long, winding driveway as rain pelted the ground. She had a calm, quiet authority about her, but her eyes were somber, as if she had seen too much in her years of dealing with the supernatural. When she stepped out of the car, her long, dark coat trailing behind her, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Margaret had seen what they were going through, but would she be able to help them? The air around them seemed to thicken as Margaret entered the house. The temperature dropped immediately, and Sarah could hear the familiar whispers grow louder, as if the house itself had recognized the presence of someone who might stand a chance against it. Sarah led Margaret through the house, showing her the rooms where the disturbances were strongest. The moment Margaret entered the living room, she stopped, her expression unreadable as she turned slowly in a circle, taking in the space. "Tell me everything," Margaret said quietly. "I need to know what you've experienced." As the Thompsons explained everything, the moving objects, the whispers, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched, Margaret listened intently, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She didn't interrupt, but every once in a while, she would nod or mutter something under her breath, as if confirming her own thoughts. When they finished, Margaret took a long, slow breath. "These entities are unlike anything you've encountered before," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are not ghosts. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. These things are creatures born from the darkness itself. They feed on fear. The more you fear them, the stronger they become. They don't just haunt a house, they claim it, turning it into a trap." Sarah shivered at her words. The thought of the house being alive in such a twisted way made her feel like she was suffocating. "But why us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they here? What do they want?" Margaret's gaze turned serious, and for the first time, there was a hint of fear in her eyes. "They want power. They feed on the fear of the living, growing stronger as you become weaker. They thrive on the terror they instill in their victims. But there's something else you need to understand, they are not just feeding. They are growing. If you don't stop them now, if you don't confront them, they will become too powerful to resist." Michael's voice broke through the tension. "How do we stop them?" Is there a way to get rid of them? Margaret's lips tightened. There is a way, but it's dangerous. Confronting them head-on is the only way to break their hold on this house. But it's not just about fighting them physically. These entities are born from fear, and fear is their weapon. If you face them with courage, if you stop fearing them, you can weaken them. But it's not easy. And the closer you get to facing them, the stronger they will become. Margaret outlined a plan, a course of action that would push the Thompsons to their limits. They would have to face the spirits, confront their deepest fears, and take back control of the house. The first step would be to reclaim the rooms that had been most affected by the entities, the living room, the hallway, and the children's rooms. But it wasn't just a matter of physically entering these spaces. They would need to challenge the spirits, to refuse to be controlled by their fear. Margaret would guide them, helping them prepare mentally and spiritually for the confrontation that would come. But she warned them, the spirits will fight back. They won't go down easily. And when you challenge them, when you stand against them, you might not come out unscathed. Sarah could feel the fear rising in her chest, the same fear she had felt every night since they moved in. But now, it was different. There was a sense of resolve beginning to build within her. They couldn't let these entities take their home. They couldn't let them take their family. "We can do this," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. She looked at Michael, then at Mark and Emma, who were standing behind her, their eyes wide with fear but filled with the same resolve. Margaret nodded solemnly. "You can. But you must be prepared. The final confrontation will not be easy. It will take everything you have. And when you face them, there's a chance you may not come out unscathed. But if you don't, these creatures will never leave you. They will only grow stronger. And they won't stop until they've consumed everything." The night before they were to begin their confrontation with the invisible guests, Sarah sat alone in the living room, staring into the fire. The house was silent, but the weight of the silence felt different now. It wasn't just oppressive, it was expectant. As though the house was aware of what was about to happen. It knew they were preparing to face it. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, to calm her racing thoughts. But no matter how hard she tried, the fear crept in, rising in her chest. The whispers were louder than ever before, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, just beyond her vision. Tomorrow, they would confront the spirits. Tomorrow, they would face their deepest fears. But as Sarah sat there, alone in the darkness, she wondered, what if we're not ready? And as the wind howled outside, the house creaked, as if it were answering her question. The Thompsons gathered in the living room, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. The room had grown darker as the sun set, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. The oppressive silence that had filled the house for so long had been replaced with a palpable sense of anticipation. They were about to do it. They were about to face the invisible guests that had haunted them for so long. Sarah glanced at her family, their faces pale but determined. Michael, standing beside her, met her eyes with a quiet strength, but Sarah could feel his own inner turmoil. The children stood close, their wide eyes showing a fear that no child should have to carry, but there was something else too, a courage that had been born from weeks of enduring the unknown. This was it. Margaret had prepared them. She had told them what to expect, the way the spirits would come for them, how they would lash out in desperation as they sensed their power waning. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. As they stood together, silently breathing in the tension of the moment, the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. Sarah's breath became visible, her body instantly covered in a cold sweat as the air grew thick, heavy with a malevolent energy. The room felt as though it was closing in on them, suffocating them with its weight. She could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something that had lived in this house long before they arrived, something that had claimed this space for its own. The fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, the flames flickering unnaturally, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the room. It was as if the flames were struggling to stay alive, fighting against the overwhelming darkness. The house groaned under the strain, its timbers creaking, the walls trembling as if they were alive, trying to contain the force building within them. And then the whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. The voices seemed to come from every direction, swirling around them, echoing off the walls, seeping into their minds. You cannot escape. We will never let you go. You are ours. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to steady her breath, clenching her fists. No, she thought. We will not let you win. She glanced at Michael, his face set with determination, his eyes filled with an unspoken promise. They would face this together. But the air around them thickened, the whispers growing into a maddening chorus of voices. Each whisper was like a claw scraping at their minds, feeding on their fear, feeding on their terror. The darkness in the room seemed to grow deeper, colder, and Sarah could feel it. Something was coming, something was preparing to reveal itself. And then, it happened. The shadows, which had been dancing unnaturally across the walls, began to shift. They seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive, as if the very darkness had taken on form. The shapes elongated, growing taller, thicker, their outlines jagged and distorted. For a moment, Sarah could see nothing but darkness, the entire room swallowed by it, but then, just as quickly, a shape emerged. It was a figure, tall, skeletal, and completely black, its form shifting and undulating as if it didn't quite belong in the physical world. The edges of its body blurred and flickered, like a shadow that was trying to exist in the light but couldn't quite hold its shape. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark voids, endless pits of nothingness, staring straight at them, unblinking, unfeeling. The figure stepped forward, its presence sending a wave of cold terror through Sarah's entire body. She could feel the very air in the room bending around it, distorting as if the house itself was being torn apart by its mere existence. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, as though the figure was speaking directly into their minds. Fear us. Feel our power. You cannot fight us. We are the darkness. Invisible forces slammed into the Thompsons with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. The air around them seemed to congeal into something solid, wrapping around them like chains, pulling them toward the center of the room. The temperature dropped even further, until Sarah could feel her bones freezing, her body shaking uncontrollably. But Sarah refused to be swallowed by the fear. She had come this far, and she would not give in now. She squeezed Michael's hand tighter, her fingers digging into his skin as if holding onto him would anchor her to reality. She could feel the presence of the creatures, thick, suffocating, but she stood her ground, her heart pounding fiercely in her chest. We will not fear you, she said, her voice shaking but strong. You don't control us anymore. The shadow paused. The whispers faltered, as if the words had struck a blow. For a fleeting moment, Sarah thought they might have succeeded. But then the shadows howled in fury, their form growing even larger, as if feeding on their defiance. They were not finished yet. The shadow-like figure lurched forward, its hands, if they could be called hands, reaching for them. A gust of wind whipped through the room, knocking over furniture, sending dust and debris flying. The force was overwhelming, like the air itself was being sucked into a vacuum. But even as the figure reached out to touch them, Sarah and Michael held firm. They closed their eyes for a brief moment, and in that instant, they felt it, the power of their own resolve, their refusal to bow to the darkness. And then, something shifted. The temperature slowly began to rise. The shadows flickered, their form beginning to fray, like the edges of a photograph being burned by an unseen flame. The whispers grew frantic, their voices becoming panicked, shrill. They screamed in rage as the shadows began to break apart, their form no longer solid, no longer holding together. The invisible hands that had been reaching for them turned into wisps of smoke, unraveling in the air as if they were never meant to exist. The house groaned again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the groan of something alive, it was the groan of something dying, something losing its grip. The spirits screeched in fury, their form flickering and splintering like a broken mirror, the pieces of darkness scattering into the air. The force around them began to collapse, and the house itself seemed to shudder, its walls trembling. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest as the pressure around her intensified, but she refused to falter. She would not allow herself to be consumed by the fear anymore. "We are not yours," Sarah cried, her voice now loud and unwavering. "You will not take us." The figure dissolved in front of them, vanishing into a cloud of black mist, leaving nothing but a thick, suffocating darkness in its wake. The whispers faded, becoming a distant echo that slowly died away, like the last breath of a dying storm. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The air lightened, and the oppressive weight that had filled the house for so long seemed to lift. Sarah looked around, taking in the quiet, feeling the warmth return to the room as the darkness finally began to recede. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its flames now steady and strong. But as the family stood together, victorious yet shaken, they knew that this was not the end. The spirits had been forced back, but they were not gone. They were still there, hidden in the walls, dormant and waiting. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Thompsons gathered their things as quickly as they could, the relief of the moment not enough to ease the terror that still gripped their hearts. The house, though calm for now, felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to erupt once again. They had to leave before the darkness regained its strength. As they piled into their car, ready to drive away from the nightmare they had just survived, Sarah took one last look at the house. It loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but she could still feel its pull. The house had been their prison, but now, it was nothing more than a shell. As they drove away, the faintest whisper echoed in the distance, carried by the wind. "You can run, but we will find you." Sarah shivered, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of defiance. They had faced the invisible guests, and they had won. But the spirits weren't gone. Not really. They were waiting, lurking in the darkness. And someday, they would return. But for now, the Thompsons were free. And so, the house stood silent once again, its dark, crumbling walls enveloped in the cold, still night. The echoes of the Thompsons' terror slowly faded into the past, but the house, it remained. In the silence, there was a sense of something waiting, its very foundation steeped in the memories of the souls it had consumed, the ones who had come before. The darkness never truly leaves, just slumbers, biding its time, ready to awaken the moment the next unsuspecting soul dares to step inside. The unseen guests, they never left. Though their form was hidden in the shadows, their presence was ever present, lingering, stretching out into the corners of the house, feeding on the lingering fear. Their whispers, soft and insidious, hung in the air like a suffocating fog, ready to invade the minds of those foolish enough to seek shelter within those cursed walls. As time passed, the house would stand there, forgotten by most, but always watching. Its thirst for fear unquenched, always waiting for the next victim to enter its grasp. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. And when that next family arrives, they'll find themselves face to face with the same horrors, the same unseen guests, who will feed once again. The house will draw them in, its dark embrace waiting to welcome the next unwitting souls, until they, too, become part of its dreadful history. Who's next? Thank you so much for sticking with us through this chilling tale. You've made it to the end, and we appreciate your courage in facing the dark with us. If you enjoyed the terror, the suspense, and the unsettling twists of tonight's story, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Horror. There are more stories waiting to haunt your nights, stories that will make your heart race, your skin crawl, and your mind question what is real. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on another chilling tale. We'll be back soon with more horrors, more mysteries, and more terrifying journeys into the unknown. Until then, remember, some stories never end, they only wait for the next chapter to unfold. See you soon, if you dare.